When my husband sat me down for a serious talk, he said, "I've already moved my girlfriend into the house and she's pregnant with my child." He said it the way you'd say the dishwasher needs fixing. Calm, measured. Like the words themselves were reasonable and I was the variable he hadn't fully calculated yet. I remember the exact quality of the light in our kitchen that evening. The overhead bulb we'd been meaning to replace for months, casting everything in that slightly yellow, slightly wrong tint. And I remember that there was a pot of pasta on the stove that I'd been stirring 60 seconds earlier, and that the wooden spoon was still in my hand when he said it, and that I set it down on the counter so carefully, so precisely, like if I placed it correctly enough, the rest of the world might also hold its shape. His name was Dominic Farrell. We had been married for 9 years. And the woman he had moved into our house, the one I had co-signed the mortgage on, the one where I had painted the hallway with my own hands on a rainy October weekend, was already asleep upstairs in the guest bedroom, which he had apparently furnished with a new bed frame he'd ordered online 3 weeks ago without saying a word. I had been with Dominic since I was 27. We met at a work conference in a city neither of us lived in, and he had that quality some men have of making you feel like the most specifically chosen person in a room. Not flattered exactly, but selected, which felt more real than flattery at the time. He was an operations manager for a logistics firm, organized to the point of being occasionally maddening, the kind of man who kept a running grocery list in a dedicated app and never forgot a bill due date. We bought the house in our 5th year together. I worked as a senior compliance analyst for a financial services company, good salary, demanding hours, the kind of job where you spent a lot of energy making sure everything was above board, which I found out later was darkly funny in the context of what was happening in my own home. We didn't have children. We had talked about it in the abstract, the kind of married couple talking that circles back on itself without ever landing. I had noticed over the preceding year that Dominic's phone had developed a new kind of privacy. Screen down on tables, bathroom trips that lasted longer than they used to, a new password I hadn't been given. I told myself he was planning a surprise. That is the thing about trust. It generates explanations for you so you don't have to look directly at what's actually there. Her name was Renata. He told me this with the same composure, following up the initial statement with what appeared to be a prepared sequence of information, as though he had rehearsed the order of revelations for maximum efficiency. Renata, 29 years old. They had been together for 14 months. She was 11 weeks pregnant. He had been, in his word, intending to tell me for some time, but had wanted to wait until the situation was stable. Stable. I picked the word up and turned it over in my mind like a stone you find on the ground and can't quite identify. He had wanted the situation to be stable before he told me that another woman was pregnant with his child and was now sleeping in my guest bedroom on a bed frame he had ordered online while I was presumably at work being a compliance analyst, ensuring that other people's financial instruments were fully, properly above board disclosed. There is a specific sensation that happens when your brain receives information it cannot process. Not pain exactly, not shock exactly, but a kind of cognitive stutter, like a record skipping in the same groove. I stood in my kitchen with the wooden spoon on the counter and experienced that sensation for what felt like a long time. Then I asked him to leave the room. He looked briefly surprised, which was the first crack in the composure, and then he left. I didn't cry that night. I want to be clear about that, because later when I was telling the story to people, some of them seemed to expect that the crying happened immediately, and I think that expectation says something about what people think devastation looks like. Devastation, in my experience, looks a lot like function. It looks like going upstairs to the master bedroom and locking the door and sitting on the edge of the bed and making a list on your phone of things you need to do in the next 24 hours. I called my friend Brigitte, who had been my closest friend for 12 years and who had a forensic accountant's brain for other people's problems, meaning she gathered information before she reacted. I told her everything in a single continuous sentence, and she was quiet for 4 seconds, and then she said, "Do not move out of that house." I hadn't been planning to, but hearing her say it made me understand that this was going to be a situation in which people tried to move me, and that the first form of resistance available to me was to stay exactly where I was. I wrote that on my list too. Stay in the house. Then I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of my home doing what homes do. The refrigerator cycling, a car passing outside, the faint creak of the guest bedroom floor that I now knew contained a 29-year-old woman who was 11 weeks pregnant with my husband's child. And I thought, with a clarity that surprised me, he planned this. Not just the relationship. The disclosure, the furniture, the sequence. All of it was planned. I want to tell you about Dominic's planning, because it matters to what came later. Dominic was the kind of man who did not make spontaneous decisions. He researched purchases for weeks before committing. He planned vacations 6 months in advance. When we'd bought the house, he had created a spreadsheet with 43 line items covering every cost from mortgage payments to projected maintenance. So when I began, in the days following his announcement, to look backward over the preceding 14 months with fresh attention, I understood that nothing I was finding was accidental. The new bed frame in the guest room, ordered and delivered on a Wednesday afternoon while I was at the office, signed for by Dominic, assembled over a weekend when he told me he was going to visit a colleague. The grocery patterns. I pulled up our shared account on the app and found that for the last 2 months, the weekly grocery shop had included items I didn't buy and didn't eat, a specific brand of prenatal vitamins, ginger tea, a type of crackers I'd never seen in our kitchen. I had not noticed because I was not looking. I was trusting. The distinction felt, at that moment, physically painful. I had been a compliance analyst for 11 years, and I had not noticed the most non-compliant thing happening in my own house because I had extended to my husband the assumption of good faith that I would never have extended to a financial instrument. That is what trust does. It makes you professionally stupid in your personal life. I called an attorney on the 3rd day. Her name was Philippa Osei, a family law specialist with 14 years of practice, recommended by Brigitte, who had the presence of mind to ask her own lawyer for a referral before I'd even thought to. Philippa's office was on the 11th floor of a building downtown, clean-lined and quiet, with the specific atmosphere of a place where difficult things were handled without drama. She listened to the full situation without interrupting, asked 4 precise questions, and then told me what my position was. The house was jointly owned with an equal mortgage contribution from both of us. Dominic could not remove me from the property without a court order. His girlfriend, Renata, was a guest, and her presence in the home was technically at his invitation, which was legally complicated given the joint ownership but not immediately removable without formal proceedings. Philippa's advice was to document everything, not to confront Renata directly, and to begin preparing financial disclosures because in a divorce involving a jointly owned property and potentially a child support obligation to a third party, the financial picture was going to become contested very quickly. She said the words, divorce and child support with the same neutral efficiency a doctor uses to say biopsy, not unkind, just precise, in the way that precision is a form of respect when someone is struggling to hold a clear view of their situation. I hired her that afternoon. The retainer was $4,500. I paid it from my personal savings account, which I had maintained separately from our joint account throughout our marriage, not out of suspicion, but out of habit, and which now felt like the most accidentally prescient decision I had ever made. The living situation in the weeks that followed was something I still find difficult to describe in terms that capture the precise texture of it. Dominic and I were in the same house. Renata was in the same house. I had decided, on Philippa's advice and my own instinct, to maintain a surface normality that gave nothing away while I organized. I went to work. I came home. I cooked, occasionally, and ate at the kitchen table while Dominic and Renata ate in what had apparently been designated as a companionable arrangement in the living room, the specific geography of which I refused to acknowledge by looking at it directly. Renata was, and I am trying to be factual here rather than unkind, younger than I had expected, not in years but in demeanor, with the quality of someone who had been told a story about a situation and had not yet needed to test that story against reality. She was polite to me in the way someone is polite when they have been coached to be polite, carefully, with slight pauses before responses, as though she was checking each sentence against an internal guideline. She called me by my name, Vivian, which I found oddly formal given that she was sleeping 15 feet down the hall from me and was carrying my husband's child. I did not engage with her beyond functional household logistics. I was saving my energy for other things. The other things included, during this period, a conversation with Dr. Amara Okonkwo, a therapist I had found through my company's employee assistance program, who specialized in relational trauma and had a way of asking questions that made you feel like you were being handed tools rather than examined. I saw her twice a week in those first months. At our second session, she said something that reorganized the way I was seeing the situation. She said, "The thing that's making this hard to process isn't just the betrayal. It's that the betrayal was executed with precision. He didn't fall into something. He built something. And your nervous system knows the difference even if your conscious mind is still catching up." I wrote that down on my phone while she was still speaking and I looked at it on the train home. Your nervous system knows the difference. Mine had known for months. I had just been explaining its signals away. The nights I'd woken at 3 a.m. for no reason. the slight tension I'd felt when Dominic was on his phone, the time I'd walked into the kitchen and found him at the counter with his laptop positioned so the screen wasn't visible from the door, and he'd smiled and closed it and said he was ordering something for the house. And I had accepted this because it was the kind of thing Dominic said, and it was the kind of thing I believed because I was trusting, and because I was tired, and because trust is partly a form of exhaustion management. You cannot inspect everything, so you choose what to trust, and sometimes that choice turns out to be catastrophically wrong. I found the secondary account on a Monday, 5 weeks after the initial disclosure. I want to be clear that I wasn't hacking anything or doing something legally questionable. I found it because Dominic had linked a secondary email to our shared family tablet that he had apparently forgotten we owned, and which had been sitting in a kitchen drawer for a year. I picked it up to use as a recipe viewer while cooking and found the account open. I did not open his messages. I photographed the screen, showing the account name and the preview of the inbox, and immediately sent the photo to Philippa. Her response was efficient. She told me to put the tablet back exactly where I found it and to avoid accessing anything further, and that she would advise me on how to proceed through proper legal channels so that any evidence gathered would be admissible. The following week, through the formal discovery process Philippa had initiated, we obtained records showing that this secondary account had been active for 16 months, 1 month before Renata, and had been used to manage a separate set of financial transactions including payments to a short-term rental that predated Renata's move into our house, communications with what appeared to be a financial advisor operating on accounts Dominic held in his name only, and, most significantly for the divorce proceedings, evidence that Dominic had been systematically transferring small amounts from our joint account into a personal account over a period of approximately 18 months. The transfers were small enough individually to avoid triggering alerts. The total, across the entire period, was $38,400. I stared at that number in Philippa's office, sitting across from her at the clean-lined desk, and thought about the spreadsheet he had made when we bought the house. 43 line items. He was that kind of planner. He had been planning this for at least 18 months. Philippa brought in a forensic accountant named Gordon Abiodun, 22 years in financial litigation, who spent 2 weeks going through every account connected to Dominic with the thoroughness of someone who had spent 2 decades finding things people had tried to hide. Gordon was a quiet man with reading glasses he kept on a cord around his neck, and a habit of making small, precise notations in pencil in the margins of printed documents. He found the $38,400 in transferred funds. He found a brokerage account in Dominic's name, holding approximately $92,000 in assets that had never been disclosed as a marital asset, funded over the course of our marriage through a mixture of diverted joint funds and personal income that had been underreported on our joint tax filings. He found evidence that Dominic had consulted a divorce attorney, a different one, not Philippa, approximately 14 months ago, 1 month before the secondary email account was opened. He had been planning the divorce before he had started the relationship, or possibly simultaneously. The timeline made it unclear which came first, the exit strategy or the affair, but what the timeline made unmistakably clear was that while I was at work ensuring other people's financial disclosures were accurate and complete, my husband was running an 18-month operation to position himself favorably in a divorce he had already decided was coming. Gordon presented his findings with the same quiet precision with which he made his pencil notations, setting each document on Philippa's desk in sequence, and I sat there and watched the architecture of what Dominic had built being laid out in front of me, and I felt something shift in my chest that wasn't grief exactly. It was clarity. The specific relief of seeing a thing fully and knowing you are now equipped to respond to it accurately. The crisis point came on a Thursday morning, 7 weeks after the initial disclosure, and it came from a direction I had not anticipated. I received a call at 9:15 a.m. from a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered it, a woman identified herself as Nadia Brentwood, a journalist with a regional online publication that covered local business and finance. She said she had received information, she didn't specify from whom, that a compliance analyst at my firm had been involved in a domestic situation involving financial irregularities, and that she was reaching out for comment before publishing. My stomach dropped through the floor of my office. I kept my voice absolutely level. I told her I had no comment and disconnected. Then I sat for approximately 3 seconds before my hands started shaking, and I picked up my phone and called Philippa. Philippa told me to call my firm's legal department immediately, which I did. The firm's general counsel, a man named Bertrand Nakamura, who had been in corporate law for 26 years, was in my office within the hour, and the three of us, me, Bertrand, and Philippa via phone, reconstructed what had clearly happened. Dominic, or someone acting on his behalf, had made contact with this journalist in an attempt to preemptively damage my professional reputation, presumably to complicate my financial position in the divorce proceedings, and potentially to create grounds for questioning my credibility as a witness in the forensic accounting findings. It was, in its way, the most clarifying thing Dominic had done, because until that moment, Philippa had been advising a controlled, documentation-focused approach to the divorce. After that call, the approach changed. Bertrand Nakamura, with 26 years in corporate law and the particular manner of someone who considered attempted professional sabotage a personal affront to orderly process, was moved to action in a way that purely personal grievance might not have managed. He contacted the publication's editor directly, identifying himself as legal counsel for the firm, and informed them that any suggestion of professional impropriety against a named employee, absent specific documented evidence of actual wrongdoing, would expose the publication to a defamation claim. He also provided, with my permission, a summary of the forensic accounting findings pertaining to Dominic's financial conduct, including the diverted funds and the undisclosed brokerage accounts, which reframed the narrative of who in this situation had engaged in financial irregularities rather comprehensively. Nadia Brentwood never published the story she'd called me about. What she published instead, 3 weeks later, was a piece about undisclosed marital assets and the forensic accounting practices used to uncover them, which quoted Gordon Abiodun by name and used my case, without identifying me, as its primary illustrative example. I read it on a Friday morning at my kitchen table, with Dominic somewhere upstairs and Renata presumably still asleep in the guest room, and I felt the cold, clean satisfaction of watching someone's plan turn completely around and face in the opposite direction. The divorce proceedings moved quickly after that, partly because Philippa was one of those attorneys who understood that momentum was a legal instrument, and partly because the forensic evidence was extensive enough that Dominic's attorney advised settlement rather than litigation. I was not at the meeting where this advice was given, but Philippa described it to me afterward with the economical pleasure of someone reporting a favorable outcome. Dominic's attorney, she said, had gone quiet when Gordon's full report was presented. Quiet in the specific way of a person recalculating. The settlement terms included my full buyout from the house, meaning Dominic would need to refinance and pay me my equity share. The recovery of the $38,400 in diverted funds, a claim against the undisclosed brokerage account as a marital asset, and a full financial disclosure requirement going forward. The divorce was finalized 4 months after I had stood in that kitchen with the wooden spoon in my hand and been told that another woman was pregnant with my husband's child. 4 months. Which sounds fast until you understand that I had been, without knowing it, preparing for the end of this marriage for 9 years by maintaining my own credit, my own savings, my own professional reputation, and my own clarity of mind. All of that preparation had been accidental. But it had happened anyway. And it was enough! I need to tell you about the part that didn't feel like victory, because this kind of story is always told as a victory, and that framing leaves something important out. On the night the settlement was signed, I drove home to the house that I was now in the process of extracting myself from financially, and I sat in my car in the driveway for a long time before going inside. Not because I was sad, exactly. Not because I wished it had gone differently. But because 9 years is a long time to spend building a life with someone, and no amount of forensic accounting or favorable settlement terms gives you back the version of yourself that believed the life you were building was real. Dominic had not just taken money. He had taken a chunk of the trust I used to extend toward the world, the default assumption of good faith that makes ordinary life navigable, and I was going to have to rebuild that from a different foundation than the one I'd started with. Dr. Okonkwo and I talked about this in our sessions over the months that followed. She said, "You don't get the old trust back, but you get something better eventually, which is trust that's been tested and knows its own limits." I was working on believing that. Some days I did. Renata had the baby in the spring, a boy, which I found out from Brigitte, who had heard it from someone. I did not hear it from Dominic. By the time the baby was born, Dominic and I had not spoken in 6 weeks except through our attorneys. I had moved into a rented apartment that was smaller than the house but had better light, and I had spent 3 weekends painting the walls colors I had chosen entirely alone, which felt like both a small and a very significant thing. I thought about Renata sometimes, not with the anger I might have expected, but with a kind of distant observation. She had been told a story too, I thought. She had probably been told the same careful, sequenced story Dominic told all the important people in his life, calibrated to make him look like the reasonable center of every situation. She was going to learn, if she hadn't already, what that story had cost the previous person who believed it. That was not my problem anymore. I had enough to carry. Brigitte came for dinner on a Saturday evening about 3 months after the divorce was finalized, bringing wine and the kind of direct presence that had made her irreplaceable throughout the preceding months. We sat at my small table in the better-lit apartment, and she said, "You know what the insane thing is?" "What?" I said. She said, "He thought the planning was his advantage. He thought because he planned it, he controlled it. But the planning is what destroyed him. Because you can't build an 18-month exit strategy without leaving evidence, and you can't leave evidence against a compliance analyst without getting caught." I thought about that. I thought about the grocery app and the prenatal vitamins I hadn't noticed, and Gordon Abuden's pencil notations, and Bertrand Nakamura's phone call to the editor, and Philippa's phrase about momentum as a legal instrument, and the $38,400 recovered, and the brokerage account that had been hidden for 9 years. I thought about the fact that Dominic had spent 18 months building something intended to leave me with less, and that the architecture of what he built had become, when examined correctly, the architecture of his own accountability. I raised my glass. "He planned it to the last detail," I said. "He just forgot that I was better at this than he was." And then I drank my wine, in my apartment with the good light and the walls I had painted myself, and felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time.